So at this point, we're going to turn to the topic of linking assessment to instruction. And Dr. Margie Gillis. Margie, thank you.
Thank you, Donna, and happy to be here today to talk about this very important topic. I think Jewel teed this up very nicely, describing what we're looking for in terms of assessment and diagnosis. So I'm going to just add on to that and speak specifically about what instruction should look like for students with dyslexia. And I want to just highlight 3 important points here. The first is that we want to choose an intervention that matches the student's strengths and weaknesses in the areas of learning, language, and literacy. And so I will be speaking more about that. Secondly, we want to make sure that we're monitoring the student's progress frequently, because things change and some children don't respond as quickly as others. So we don't want to assume that this child is going to follow a certain course. It changes daily, and so we have to adjust all the time. That the only way we're going to adjust with fidelity and do an adequate job of instructing these students is to collect data and make sure that we change the course if necessary. And lastly, I just want to mention how important it is to nurture children's assets and talents. School is very difficult for many of these children, and as such, they're working hard, they get frustrated. They need to have outlets. They need to have people around them who acknowledge what they're good at and celebrate that, so that it really helps them to continue to work hard and persevere. I don't think I've ever given a talk without showing this slide. Hollis Scarborough developed this model to convey how complex reading is. And there are 2, I think, important points here, that skilled reading requires a coordination of 2 major components. The first is skilled readers have to have good language comprehension. So they have to rely on background knowledge of topics that they're reading about. They have to have good vocabulary knowledge. They have to understand language at the sentence level. They have to have good verbal reasoning skills in order to make inferences. They have to have knowledge about text structures. All of those strands are about being strategic and metacognitive in applying comprehension skills. The bottom of the rope shows what's required in terms of word reading or decoding. And those 3 strands include having phonemic awareness, which Jewel spoke about and I'll talk a little bit more about, being able to read words automatically and accurately, and being able to look at words and automatically know what that word is. So those skills and those strands have to do with being automatic. We talk about automaticity. So I'll come back to that. But what I want to convey here is that there are many pieces to becoming a good skilled reader, and coordinating this idea of comprehending what you're reading while decoding those words accurately and automatically is what needs to occur to be able to comprehend complex text. 2 researchers, Gough and Tunmer, proposed the idea that reading comprehension is the product of those 2 components that I just described. So on the rope, I inserted LC for language comprehension and D for decoding. And it's the product of the 2, because if you are a great decoder but your language comprehension is poor, your reading comprehension will be impacted. So we talk about 1 times 0 equals 0. Conversely, for the dyslexic student, their decoding is poor, and often they have strengths in language comprehension. However, their reading comprehension will be impacted. So 0 times 1 would therefore be 0. And to further explain this concept, we can look at a student's phonological skills, which are relevant to decoding, and their comprehension skills, which are relevant, obviously, to the language comprehension that I just spoke about. So you can have poor word reading and poor comprehension and have what Jewel referred to as a mixed reading disability. Or you could have good word reading, good decoding, and poor comprehension and have what we refer to as a specific comprehension deficit that would impact the areas in the top of that rope that I just explained. Or you can be good in both, and therefore you're a skilled reader because you have both components solidly in place. And the fourth profile that we're speaking about today is the dyslexic profile. Some researchers refer to dyslexia as RD, or reading disability. So the literature often refers to these students with this specific profile that Jewel spoke about, where phonological processing is the area of difficulty. And that phonological processing difficulty impacts the student's ability to decode, that is, sound words out, and encode, apply the sound to the symbol, which I'll speak more about. The whole point of this is to say that one size doesn't fit all. So my experience in schools is that schools want to provide interventions to students, and they want to do the right thing, and they often look for an intervention that will work for students who are struggling, but sometimes they don't match the intervention to the student's profile, and that's very, very important. So at the very least, we should be looking for interventions for students with phonological processing difficulties that specifically target those areas, and that's what I'll be talking more about. The Literacy How Reading Wheel was created to have a visual of the core components of comprehension. The 5 core components that the National Reading Panel identified in 2000 were phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. As we looked at the findings from that report and that work, we folks that worked at Haskins Laboratories with me prior to founding Literacy How, we were struck by the fact that there were some what we would consider important points, important missing components of reading and literacy. So I'll speak more about spelling in a minute, but you'll notice that the segment of the wheel that includes phonics also acknowledges that phonics includes spelling. You'll notice morphology was added to vocabulary. I will not be speaking about that today, but that's incorporated in our vocabulary instruction. And then you'll notice that written expression is included with text comprehension, and I'll briefly speak about that in a bit. You'll also notice that fluency is not here, and I will also speak about that and why we chose to replace fluency with syntax. But for today's discussion, I'm going to primarily focus on phonemic awareness and phonics. Phonemic awareness, as the next slide says, is an awareness of and the ability to manipulate sounds, what we call phonemes, individual speech sounds, of which English has 44. You'll notice the professor pointing to the word dog and splat. And what I want to point out here is that phonemic awareness is an auditory skill. And so phonemic awareness instruction does not include specifically letters. Once we add letters to the conversation or the equation, we get phonics. So I'll speak more about that in a bit. I do want to just highlight some important points about phonemic awareness, and these are all based on solid research. The first is that phonemic awareness can be developed through instruction. Most children who are identified with dyslexia, by virtue of the fact that it is considered a phonologically based disability, have difficulty with phonemic awareness. However, most of those children can be taught to segment those sounds and work with those sounds, and it is an incredibly important and prerequisite skill, what we call necessary but not sufficient, but a very important foundational skill. It is also an incredibly strong predictor. So as Jewel talked about earlier, it would be part of a screener, a very important part of a screener, to know if children can actually segment those sounds in words. We also see here that teaching phonemic awareness reduces the incidence of reading problems. Children who would not qualify necessarily for a diagnosis of dyslexia, many of those children also have difficulty segmenting those sounds. And so phonemic awareness instruction should really be included in every kindergarten curriculum, whether or not a child or the children are suspected of being dyslexic. Linking phonemic awareness with instruction with letter instruction is very good practice, and there's lots of research to support that. So I'm not saying not to include the letters. I'm just saying that phonemic awareness, as is defined and described, is not instruction that includes the focus on the letters. That, again, is what we would call phonics instruction. And that's an important point. As Jewel pointed out, we will post the hierarchy of skills that are really important when you do phonemic awareness instruction. And assessing where the students are in that hierarchy is an important first step. And the last piece of research on phonemic awareness is the importance that that instruction is phonemically explicit. And what do I mean by that? If you go to the next slide, you'll see about what to do for phonemic awareness instruction. And the last bullet point talks about teaching articulatory gestures. What that means, and Donna could probably describe this better as a speech and language pathologist, but I'll give it a shot, is it's really helping the child understand how those sounds are made in the mouth, how they're articulated, feeling. You'll see the picture of somebody sort of feeling their larynx, so understanding if there's a vibration when the sound is made, looking in a mirror and seeing how the sound is made. This is a multi-sensory kind of approach that many students need to be able to actually do that phonemic segmentation that we spoke about. Picture sorts are great for instructional practice. Again, this is an auditory kind of approach. They're not looking at the words here. They're looking at pictures, and they're listening to the sounds maybe in the beginning, at the end, and in the middle of the picture. And Say It and Move It is a tried and true research-based method for doing phonemic segmentation. And this is a picture of an Elkonin spot. The picture here is of a dress. So there are 4 sounds in dress. It's dis, er, s, and this is a more explicit way to teach phonemic awareness. So now moving on to phonics, and I include spelling here. Phonics is the study and use of these sound spelling correspondences. It also includes teaching syllable patterns, which are the vowel patterns in English spelling. Spelling we also call encoding. It's reciprocal to decoding. Children should be receiving spelling instruction that coordinates and is coordinated with and part and parcel of the decoding instruction. As it says here, in order to spell a word, we must first hear those individual sounds and write the letter that corresponds with that sound. We go from speech to print, and when reading we go from when spelling we go from speech to print. When reading we go from print to speech. Research highlights systematic phonics instruction is more effective than what we might call embedded or implicit. Children with dyslexia need very explicit presentation of those skills in a very well-defined scope and sequence. We also know word recognition skill fosters comprehension, so the two are very highly correlated. Teaching the vowel patterns, as I mentioned, ensures that children can read words accurately. 85% of our words can be decoded accurately. A couple of highlights for methodology for teaching phonics. One of my favorites is what we call speech-to-print maps. So here you see a picture of words that have been segmented by sound, and then the sounds have been translated to the grapheme or letters that represent those sounds. When we do this, we start with the closed syllable because that's the easiest one, the most transparent and regular. And then the other important point to make here is that children need to master each step before they move to the next one. I want to just speak briefly about dyslexia and spelling. Individuals with dyslexia can learn to decode more easily than they can learn to encode. Most dyslexics will struggle with spelling, but what you want to do is teach it so that they at least can approximate the spelling and spell phonetically. So we must accommodate for spelling, and that means that we grade the students' work not on their spelling but on the content. We give them assistive technology tools and proofreading assistance, and then we encourage them to turn in their rough drafts so they can check spelling and correct that and then go back to the important work of developing their ideas. I want to speak briefly about fluency because I mentioned that we took it out of our reading wheel, but we did not take it out for any other reason than the fact that I think what we saw was a lot of practice of getting kids to read fast, and it was an emphasis on fluency. As Jewel explained, many dyslexic children struggle with reading fluently, and while they certainly can improve that, it should not be overly emphasized. So the importance is that they're reading these words accurately and that they're reading fast enough to make meaning. I also want to explain that prosody is a part of the fluency instruction that should be included. And prosody just simply refers to the intonation that we have when we read and the phrasing that we do as skilled readers. And phrasing just means grouping those words into grammatical entities. So you see here, a gigantic pine tree is the noun phrase. In my front yard is a prepositional phrase. Was covered with snow is a verb phrase. Throughout the winter, another phrase. And when you help students with that grammatical phrasing, you're also working on syntax, which is another important part of building the students' skills in reading and comprehension. So just to reiterate a couple things, when we're working on fluency, and it is important to work on fluency, but you want to really work on developing the accurate reading first. Using repeated reading helps with this aspect of developing prosody, and just understanding that oral reading is difficult for many of these students. What you don't want to do when you're doing fluency interventions is to promote memorization of sight words. As I said, 85% of the words in the English language are regular, phonetically regular. So we don't want to be flashing sight words to students in lieu of teaching them accurate decoding. We do not want to emphasize speed. It's not about reading fast. It's about reading accurately and fast enough. We don't want to use a 3-cueing system model because children with decoding difficulties over-rely on context, and so we're teaching them bad habits. If we're telling them to look at pictures first, they need to be looking at the word first and foremost. And lastly, we don't want to drill and kill. So I want to speak briefly about text comprehension and written comprehension, written expression. As I mentioned earlier, the classic dyslexic, and I'm not sure that there are too many of them out there, but the typical student with dyslexia has strong language comprehension skills, and that is a great strength. However, because they're not reading a lot, you'll notice that comprehension starts to suffer, especially in the later years in the elementary grades and into middle school. It just makes sense that the more you read, the better you get, the better your comprehension gets, your vocabulary improves, etc. Written expression is defined here as a complex process, and I'll speak about that more in a minute. But just written expression tends to be an area that's very difficult for students with dyslexia, and I'll explain why in a moment. Back to text comprehension. Because our students with dyslexia are not reading avidly, because reading is difficult, they're not practicing their comprehension skills. They can be quite good at an oral level, but when they start to read themselves, things break down because they're spending so much of their cognitive energy, we call it, on lifting the word off the page. They're not able to focus as much on the comprehending of the text. So these students need explicit instruction in comprehending words, phrases, sentences, paragraphs, and all the way up to the discourse level. I want to specifically mention that many of these students also benefit from explicit instruction in reading sentences and comprehending those sentences. And lastly, teaching text structures is also a very important part of the comprehension. Again, I don't have time today to talk more about this, but I did want to at least acknowledge some of those good practices. Likewise, written expression. Don't have a lot of time here, but what I want to say about this is that writing is a very complex process. Teachers acknowledge the fact that they have difficulty teaching writing. Many of them will tell you it's the last thing. It's the last thing I do. I have so much to do. I have to teach reading. I have to teach this, that, and the other. And they'll admit that writing sort of falls off the table. Well, this is unfortunate because writing is obviously a very important thing to emphasize. And our students that we're talking about today really need good writing instruction. Writing is comprised of many sub-processes, the first of which is what we call lower level. They're described as transcription skills, these having to do with writing, handwriting, and spelling. And then higher level skills that are more about cognition, metacognitive abilities, and these include writing good sentences, using text structure to help organize the writing, developing ideas, what we call ideation, including vocabulary. Jewel pointed out something very important. Our students might have great vocabulary knowledge, but if they can't spell the words, they often default to a less robust word or a less precise word. And then lastly, executive function is a huge part of writing. And many of our students, though we haven't talked about this today, might have a co-occurring problem with attention deficit. Attention deficit implicates executive function, and you'll find that these students really struggle with writing because of that. And then just a word about handwriting instruction. Many of our students, again, talking about co-occurring difficulties, they might also be dysgraphic. Dysgraphia has to do with handwriting and being able to form the letters properly. And if these children don't receive explicit instruction in letter formation, and this really needs to occur in preschool, and have good pencil grip and form the letters from top down, left, right, they're not going to be automatic in writing. And there's good research. Virginia Berninger has done great research on showing the correlation between automaticity in forming letters and written composition. I want to end my talk here with some conversation about the teacher. I think this quote really speaks volumes about what is required of the individuals that need to work with our children with dyslexia. That is, that learning is hard work for these children. And a corollary is that teachers' instruction is very hard work. It requires an enormous amount of effort and training, because they're just, they have lots of frustration, a lot of angst, and teachers really have to have a lot of tricks up their sleeve and great training to do the job. An organization that I've been involved with for probably 40 years now, the International Dyslexia Association, published knowledge and practice standards for teachers of reading several years ago. I want to give a shout out to Louise Spear-Swirling, one of our colleagues who's phenomenal researcher, a great professor, and she was on the team that developed these standards. You can find them at this website. These standards are really a wonderful guide for professional development for teachers. They articulate very clearly what teachers need to know and be able to do in the classroom to meet the needs of all children, really, but specifically these children with dyslexia need very well-trained teachers. There are 16 higher ed programs that have been reviewed and accredited by IDA thus far, and more to come. So take a look at that. And as I've spoken today about interventions, I just want to highlight 5 important elements of successful interventions that are more general, really. This research comes from Al-Otaiba and Connor. The first is that interventions have to be explicit and systematic. That means that you're directly teaching the skills and you're teaching them in a sequence. The instruction needs to focus on phonology, and we talked about that, the sound system of the language, and the alphabetic code, how those sounds are mapped onto letters. Our instruction needs to be engaging because, again, these children have struggled and school is not fun for them. So we need to keep them engaged. It needs to be interactive and multidisciplinary. We want to allow students opportunities to respond. This is really, really important. We need to get feedback from them all the time. So the child should be doing as much of the talking and responding as the teacher is teaching. And fourth, giving them lots of opportunities to practice. Most of you who have worked with individuals with dyslexia will remark on the fact that they knew it one day and they can come back the next day and they seem to have lost what you thought they knew. So they have to have lots of opportunities to practice. You have to review the concepts repeatedly, and again, mastery learning. They have to master the skills before moving on to the next. And lastly, I haven't spoken a lot about this, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of having progress monitoring data, and then this idea of intervention fidelity. So if you're using a specific intervention, it has to be done with fidelity, the way that it was prescribed and written. IDA, the International Dyslexia Association, in an effort to join forces and bring people together, has defined these interventions that work for the students with dyslexia as structured literacy interventions. Some of you are probably familiar with the term multisensory structured language. Multisensory simply means that we're using all of our senses. So that's just good practice. There's no research to say multisensory works, and that's a tricky thing, but there isn't. So we took multisensory out of the term, and we now call it structured literacy. So a lot of the folks out there who are doing great work, Orton Gillingham, Wilson, Slingerland, Project Read, I don't want to leave folks out of this, but there are lots of structured literacy interventions around, and we're looking to unite these groups in an effort to give children good instruction and describe what that should include. So here I've just listed a few things. It's language-based. So hopefully you've heard me talk loud and clear about the language underpinnings of literacy. And I didn't mention, but I will now, at the center of the reading wheel is oral language, because oral language is the core. We also talked about the importance of intervention being diagnostic and prescriptive. Diagnostic just means you're constantly looking at what the specific difficulties are, and then you're matching instruction to those difficulties. Systematic means that we're just doing things in very explicit ways and teaching directly. Sequential, we're following a scope and sequence. Cumulative, we're not teaching something that hasn't been introduced before, and the knowledge is a cumulative process. And then finally, making sure that when a child responds with a wrong answer, we're not going to tell them what the right answer is. We're going to respond and give them corrective feedback that will lead them to discover the correct answer. It's difficult to sort of describe that, but it's a very important part of working with these children. And then I just want to end again reiterating the importance of finding the strengths of these children. So Sally Shaywitz, in her book Overcoming Dyslexia, talks about an encapsulated weakness in decoding that is surrounded by strengths. This does not say that a child with dyslexia is good in all these areas, but what it does say is that they have strengths, and they may have one of these strengths in concept formation or reasoning or critical thinking, or they could have 3 or 4, in some cases all. But the point is they have strengths, and sometimes it's hard to find what those strengths are, but we must do that, and we must work with a strength-based model to work on building the deficit areas and the weaknesses.